Hello everyone, this is Colin once again. I know I just made a recent video about Sam Harris, and this video is a continuation of my thoughts about Sam Harris. In that video, I specifically focused on a portion of the notes at the end of the main text of his book, The End of Faith, published in 2005. I would also like to let everyone know that I posted a blog article on my WordPress account, which I would encourage everyone to check out. That is my article where I discussed a clip here on YouTube where Sam Harris was on Big Think, and specifically talking about the question of metaphorical understanding of Scripture, or the question of, aren't some atheists just reading text literally, and is that problematic? I post my previous video I just mentioned about Sam Harris and mystical understandings of Scripture, and I also post the Big Think clip, and then I have my text of my article where I discuss some aspects of his interview, or his response to some of those questions. So I would check all that out first if you haven't already. This video in particular, oh, and before I get to the content of this video really quick, so I am starting to do more blog posts, so I would encourage everyone to check that out. If you're on the main part of my channel, you'll see the WordPress symbol. I also have put my Goodreads symbol, the Goodreads link to my Goodreads account if you'd like to see how nerdy I'm being and what books I'm reading. And also I have put a link to my Twitter account. You'll see the Twitter symbol as well if you'd like to follow me on Twitter and see what sort of musings I'm doing when I'm on a walk or on the bus or something like that. I'll probably just be, tweeting my random thoughts when I'm out and about and away from my computer and recording a video. So if you're interested in following me in that context, please feel free to follow me, subscribe to my blog, etc. I've also been giving some thought about doing some sort of like live Google Hangout, podcast type deal, to have people be able to ask me questions in real time, or to even talk to me on Google Chat, which brings me to another point. I have in the featured channels that you can see on my page, I featured a number of users here on YouTube that I particularly enjoy their videos and their content. One of which is Reuven Goldstein, who that's the gentleman's YouTube channel, and he does a series called Interfaith Google Hangouts, and I've been a guest on a couple of the Interfaith episodes. The most recent one that we did, I was on there, so I wanted to plug his channel because the Interfaith Google Hangout's been a lot of fun, able to talk to people from different perspectives in a very different theological perspectives and spiritual traditions in a very non-polemical, very kind dialogue. And so if you want to see me say crazy things, and I guess they enjoy my company because they keep asking, they keep plugging me the link to join. So I've had a lot of fun. They're really nice gentlemen and ladies that are regular participants on that show. So anyway, there's my plugs for various things. Now to the content of this particular video. I finished Sam Harris's newest book, Waking Up, and I underlined a number of passages that I really enjoyed. I don't know. This will probably end up being. I'll probably end up doing a WordPress article as a continuation, because I could talk about this. I mean, this is something that I could devote a whole Google Hangout conversation to. So I'm just going to talk about some of the passages that stood out to me, some of my thoughts about the book. But no doubt this is going to be one of those continuing conversations, and this could spark a continued conversation. If you haven't read the book, I would suggest checking it out, regardless of whether you're an atheist, an agnostic, spiritual but not religious, fundamentalist, whatever, a liberal religious person. Anybody and everyone should read this book. I consumed this book in about 48 hours, and really very much enjoyed it. At the outset, I want to say that I actually agree with the majority of Sam Harris's thesis in this book. He talks about spirituality, he talks about the mystery of consciousness, the riddle of the self, meditation. These are the chapter titles. And chapter 5 is Guru's death, and what he means is near-death experiences, drugs, psychedelics in particular, and other puzzles. So the vast majority of the book I actually had no issue with. And I really don't have any issues with Sam Harris in this particular book. I would say that, you know, I would count myself more spiritual than religious at this point in my life. Anyway, I mean, the particular, you know, group that I currently find myself residing in is not dogmatic. It's not fundamental. It interprets scripture allegorically. Its whole approach to theology is rather nuanced in comparison to traditional Abrahamic theology. So I find myself, when I read people like Harris or Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins sort of levying attacks against what could be considered traditional Abrahamic religion, or religions, I find myself kind of staying there and going, well, that's not how I approach religion. I appreciate their criticism of it, because I do think that there should be some healthy criticism with regards to fundamentalist literalism and dogmatism, and I think there should be honest discussion and criticism about that. So I would say that I appreciated Sam Harris talking about his own spirituality, and how spirituality seems to be a subjective fact of reality. Humans experience altered states of consciousness. We seem to want to engage in spiritual practices such as yoga or meditation, contemplative practices. The only thing that he does not wish to really engage in is metaphysical hypotheses, or as he might say, metaphysical claims. So in other words, he would like to suggest, or he says as a fact, that spirituality is a fact of human experience, but he does not want spirituality to therefore equal metaphysical ideas or claims. And I think where he's coming from is he doesn't want, you know, like a dogmatic person to have a spiritual experience and go, that confirms my belief in martyrdom, or I had a static experience, therefore I believe wholeheartedly in the fact of the virgin birth, right? He wants to separate the two, right? The experience versus the metaphysical ideas. I agree and disagree with him on that. I think this is like probably the one point where I would not follow him completely. And as I was reading the book, I guess I give myself permission to think about metaphysical hypotheses. I don't mind if people, in a non-dogmatic fashion, you know, not just because of potential spiritual experiences they've had, but if they want to think, oh, I wonder what the afterlife's like, or you know, or if they've had a mystical experience and that confirms for them that there is some supreme being, or energy or force, not necessarily a personal God, but something that is just the origin of all existence. Or, for an example, if they want to say that consciousness, they have a feeling that consciousness, or they are convinced that consciousness continues on after death. Now, Sam Harris, speaking of that, in the book does not say that he confirms or denies the possibility of life after death, or continuation of consciousness after death. It's just, for him, you'd have to be able to prove it in a laboratory. Sure, I'm sure if near-death, or the element after near-death, you know, you die and you come back, if that could be established in a lab, great. You know, but to me, I don't see any issue with thinking non-dogmatically about metaphysical hypotheses. That's probably the one place where he and I would disagree. Let me just sort of, I underlined especially the first chapter on spirituality. I just wanted to read a few passages. I may reflect on some of the passages, I may not, but these are just some things that jumped out at me. On page 5, he says, I underlined, until that moment, he's talking about when he first took, I believe it was ecstasy. He took ecstasy and had this sort of overwhelming experience. He says, until that moment, I had viewed organized religion as merely a monument to the ignorance and superstition of our ancestors. But I now knew that Jesus, the Buddha, Lao Tzu, and other saints and sages of history had not all been epileptics, schizophrenic, or frauds. I still consider the world's religions to be mere intellectual ruins, maintained at enormous economic and social costs, but I now understood the important psychological truths could be found in the rubble. I had a similar thought myself a few years ago. I would not say that all organized religion are monuments, or ruins to ignorance, but I did have a similar thought process that within organized religions there are these fundamental psychological truths, irrespective of dogma. So I appreciated that. On page 6, he says 20% of Americans describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. And then I underlined, our world is dangerously riven by religious doctrines that all educated people should condemn, and yet there is more to understanding the human condition than science and secular culture generally admit. One purpose of this book is to give both these convictions intellectual and empirical support. So he wants to shirk off religious doctrine or dogma, but look at spirituality, which I think is great. One thing that he mentions in the book, that I got his point, but I don't know if I totally agree with it. He really champions Buddhism in particular, and I would say probably a certain aspects of Tibetan Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism in particular as being organizations or organized traditions that essentially allow people to have spiritual experiences. He also champions aspects of Hinduism as well. He really says that Eastern forms of religion allow individuals to have spiritual experiences that doesn't suppress their individuality and doesn't really force people to accept metaphysical doctrines or dogmas. It doesn't ram it down their throats. Whereas he says Abrahamic faiths, typically as an organized systems, do require allegiances to certain dogmas, and while he does give examples such as Meister Eckhart and Al-Hallaj for Christianity and Islam respectively, he says, well, you may have mystics or examples of individual mystics within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He doesn't really give credit to the organized traditions that these people happen to come out of. He basically is saying that mysticism or spirituality is such a universal undercurrent or universal experience that we can't really say because Meister Eckhart was a Christian or Al-Hallaj was a Muslim, that's because they had these spiritual experiences. In fact, he basically says that they were both condemned. I mean, Meister Eckhart's writings were condemned recently. I don't know how recent we're talking, but they've since been the condemnation or the censoring of them has been lifted, I think, officially by the Catholic Church. It took them a while. And unfortunately, Al-Hallaj was actually executed. Having read that argument in this book, I would agree and disagree. I would say that if one were to open a text by a Buddhist scholar, you're probably going to find something that is essentially going to tell you this is how you can meditate. It's a very hands-on experiential document. I don't know if I would say the same thing for the Bible or the Quran. I think there is such thing as devotional reading, which I'll probably talk about in another video. You can have a spiritual experience while hearing scripture, chanting something from a text. You might read a passage in the Bible that really speaks to you. But I do think that they're different because one is there's narrative, poetry, parables. The other is an instruction manual, right? As far as a spiritual instruction manual. Having said that, there are a number of people within the Abrahamic tradition that have produced mystical texts that essentially will bring people, and it's very much like the Buddhist or Hindu equivalent that he talks about. Ignatius of Loyola, his spiritual exercises. Meister Eckhart certainly talks about these things. Many Sufi groups have texts that essentially you read and they are to gear you into a certain spiritual state. Same with Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. So I felt that Sam Harris may have missed the mark on that. I mean, in principle, I see what he's saying. That Abrahamic faiths have had a history of condemning their mystical traditions. Things may be changing now, and there may have been moments in parts of history where they flourished. But I would also want to ask the question: has there ever been a time in Buddhist history, or Taoist history or Hindu history where mystics were condemned or persecuted? I don't know the answer to that question offhand, but that's something that I would like to ask. He says here, another underline that I have here is, spirituality must be distinguished from religion because people of every faith and of none have had some sort of spiritual experiences. While these states of mind are usually interpreted through the lens of one or another religious doctrine, we know that this is a mistake. Mistake? I don't know. I think that that's pretty natural for people to perhaps interpret their spiritual experience based on what their frame of reference is, which is usually their religious or non-religious identity. He then says, I'm often asked, this is on page 9, what will replace organized religion? The answer, I believe, is nothing and everything. Nothing need replace its ludicrous and divisive doctrines, such as the ideas that Jesus will return to earth and hurl unbelievers into a lake of fire, or that death in defense of Islam is the highest good. These are terrifying and debasing fictions. But what about love, compassion, and goodness and self-transcendence? Many people still imagine that religion is the true repository of these virtues. To change this, we must talk about the full range of human experience in a way that is free of dogma as the best science is as free of dogma as the best science already is. So, I can agree with that in principle. I think that certainly the future of spirituality, whether it's organized or not, has to let loose of divisive dogma and destructive dogma. I believe as I underline here on page 10, a rational approach to spirituality seems to be what is missing from secularism and from the lives of most people I meet. Yeah, I think a balance of rational spirituality is certainly a must. Another underline here on page 14, leaving aside the metaphysics, mythology, and sectarian dogma, what contemplatives throughout history have discovered is that there is an alternative to being continuously spellbound by the conversation we are having with ourselves. There's an alternative to simply identifying with the next thought that pops into consciousness, and glimpsing this alternative dispels the conventional illusions of the self. So, yeah, these are, I do really agree with him in a lot of ways. Put a question mark here and wrote in my text, I wrote, really? Page 19, no serious adherents of any faith can believe these things because most religions make claims about reality that are mutually incompatible. And I believe that in context, prior to that, he said, we are often encouraged to believe that all religions are the same. All teach the same ethical principles. All urge their followers to contemplate the same divine reality. All are equally wise. Compassion and truth in their sphere are equally divisive and false, depending on one's view. No serious adherents of any faith can believe these things because most religions make claims about reality that are mutually incompatible. He talks about exceptions to the rule, but he says that it is impossible for any faith, no matter how elastic, to fully honor the true claims of another. Well, maybe. I'm thinking of like Unitarian Universalists, more liberal manifestations of religions. He certainly talked about Hinduism, sort of engulfing, saying that, okay, if Christians, he even says, if Christians insist that Jesus is the Son of God, Hindus, for example, can just say he's the avatar of Vishnu and be done with it. Yeah, I would say that if you're going to make a dogma out of metaphysical claims, and you're going to say, I believe this, I would say that there are metaphysical theories that are mutually exclusive. For example, if the metaphysical hypothesis that when we die, we just transition to the next life, I would say that unless you build in some form of karma or reincarnation into that statement, into that theory, karma and then just dying and going to the next life, or dying and being in the grave till Judgment Day, etc., those are all mutually exclusive. So, I would agree and disagree. I think it just depends on how dogmatic you are about your metaphysical hypotheses. I still think, and he does mention the Huxley and the perennial philosophy, and one thing that I think he may have missed the mark here, this is something that I may disagree with Harris on this, he quotes Aldous Huxley's definition of the perennial philosophy. And I think if you read Huxley's book, and I'll probably do a video or a blog post about Huxley, he's talking about when you strip away the externals and the dogmas of organized religion, there's this undercurrent that seems to be universal amongst all wisdom traditions. This is something that's been highlighted by Huston Smith, Huxley, Karen Armstrong to some extent. So even though Sam Harris here on page 20 and 21 mentions Huxley in the Perennial Philosophy, he then says, although Huxley was being reasonably cautious in his wording, this notion of a highest common factor uniting all religions begins to break apart the moment one presses for details. For instance, the Abrahamic religions are incredibly dualistic and faith-based, etc., etc. So he says that, when you look at the specifics of certain metaphysical ideas, specific manifestations, you start to kind of lose this undercurrent. I would say that Huxley would agree with that. So, I don't see an issue with the Perennial Philosophy as a concept. He then says, of course, it is on page 22, it is true that specific Jews and Christians and Muslim mystics have experiences similar to those that motivate Buddhism and Advaita, but these contemplative insights are not exemplary of their faith. I don't know about that. Rather, they are anomalies that Western mystics have always struggled to understand and to honor, often at considerable personal risk. Given their proper weight, these experiences produce heterodoxies for which Jews, Christians, and Muslims have been regularly exiled or killed. Some, and this is where he gives the example of Meister Eckhart and Al-Hallaj. But what about Teresa of Avila? What about St. John of the Cross? What about St. Ignatius of Loyola? What about Rumi? What about Hafiz? What about, Maimonides? What about the author of the Zohar? I mean, they were persecuted and killed. I will say this, though, for his point, that it seems that when we talk about Hinduism or Buddhism and Taoism, the Eastern religions, quote-unquote, there seems to be a given that you're going to have this mystical, spiritual aspect to the organized religion. It's pretty much built into its construct. I will admit that within the Abrahamic faiths, there's been a tug-of-war of between the external and the esoteric, or the mystical aspect. This is why so many people refer to Sufism as the mystical undercurrent within Islam, or and why some Christians are freaked out by the idea of Christian mysticism. And why some Jews do not bother with Kabbalah, for an example. But I think that things are changing. I think that, again, depending on where you are in history and where you particularly focus your time in research, you'll find that there have been moments where mysticism has flourished in amongst the Abrahamic faiths. But I would say that he's got a point, that it's more natural, quote-unquote, for Hindus, Buddhists, Taoists to have an acceptable mystical experience. And I remember, when I was, totally in Islam, how there was cautions thrown at me, like, oh, you're studying Sufism, be careful. And so there was a huge debate, even to today, about what is Sufism in relationship to Islam. There has to be, this debate rages on. So I do think he's got a point, but I do think he sort of is neglecting parts of the narrative here. Yeah, I'm not really sure. I'm just kind of flipping through here if there's anything else to really say. I think those were some of... okay, here we go. In page 32 to 33, he says, the truths of Eastern spirituality are now no more Eastern than the truths of Western science are Western. We're merely talking about human consciousness and its possible states. My purpose in writing this book is to encourage you to investigate certain contemplative insights for yourself without accepting the metaphysical ideas that they inspired in ignorant and isolated peoples of the past. That one little paragraph there is where I think he and I would probably disagree. I think dogmatic, crystallized metaphysical ideas that have no room for revision, no room for debate, are dangerous. I think if we rather call them metaphysical hypotheses, I don't think there's anything really problematic with that. And in parts of the book, when he talks about expansion of consciousness or near-death experiences, he himself says, well, I'm not saying that there is no life after death or whatever, or continuation of consciousness, but you would have to essentially prove that in a lab. And I think it would be great if it could be proved in a lab, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to give some credence to some metaphysical hypotheses, granted they are hypotheses. There's more I could probably say about the book, but I see that my time count is about 25 minutes. So I think I'll pause there. I'll probably do an additional blog post about some other elements that I didn't get to that I'd like to comment on with regards to his book. But considering that my previous video and blog post had to do with statements that Sam Harris made in 2005 and then another one in 2011, this book was just published, I believe, last year, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 2014. I would say that, you know, reading this book, like I said, I agree with the majority of what he says in this book. There's just certain places where we might split hairs. I also, you know, he makes no mention of Emanuel Swedenborg, but maybe he's unaware of Swedenborg, or he thinks Swedenborg's too weird to give mention. But kept thinking about Swedenborgian theology and how it might offer an alternative to some of the things that he's talking about here in this book. So I think I'll stop there for now. Again, some feedback and your thoughts are always welcome. Also, tell me what you think about this idea of doing some sort of like live streaming, you know, blog, Google, whatever, Hangout, you know, live show type conversation here on my channel, if you all think that that might be interesting in the future. Okay, well, thank you all for watching, and be sure to check out, like I said, if you'd like, follow me on Twitter, check out my Goodreads account, my blog. You know, appreciate people checking out my material. So thank you all for watching. Peace be with you all.